The wind howled, whipping up thick layers of snow, swirling as if it wanted to swallow the entire forest. The space was so cold that everything seemed to freeze. Only the sound of the wind roaring echoed in the dark night. In that cruel scene, a lone figure was struggling to walk, struggling to fight against the harsh nature. Freya, a German shepherd mother dog, struggled to drag each heavy step on the white snow. Her body trembled, her thick fur could not withstand the biting cold. Her jaw was tightly closed around Max, her baby, a skinny puppy with brown and black fur, now matted by the snow and cold. Max's breaths became weaker and weaker, and that was what scared Freya the most. She could not let Max die. Freya had heard a human living on the edge of the forest, a human unlike the people who had chased her away. That person did not hunt, did not chase away wild animals. The old and wounded animals in the forest had been helped by that hand. But those were just rumors in the wild. Was it true? Would that person help her and Max? There was no time to hesitate. Freya clenched her jaw, hugged Max, and continued walking. Her feet sank deep into the thick snow, each step a challenge. The storm showed no signs of stopping. The wind grew stronger, blowing flakes of snow into her face, blurring her vision. Layers of ice gradually clung to Freya's thick fur, freezing her. She wanted to stop, to rest a bit to regain her strength, but Max could not wait any longer. Suddenly, a howl rang out in the distance. Freya stopped, her ears pricked up in alertness. It was not the howl of her kind, it was that of the predators of the night. Wolves. Her alert instincts kicked in, and she scanned her surroundings. Shadows flickered between the snow-covered trees. Eyes glowed in the darkness, peeking out from between the bare branches. They were watching her, waiting. Freya shivered, not only from the cold, but also from the danger. In her current state, she could not fight. If she ran, they would chase her. If she stopped, they would surround her. An exhausted mother dog and a dying puppy, no match for a hungry pack of wolves. She had to keep going. Freya lowered her head, picking up speed, running forward step by step. Snow kicked up as she stomped on the ground. The howls behind her grew louder. They were coming. She could hear the pounding of footsteps in the snow. A wolf suddenly lunged forward, blocking her path. It bared its fangs and snarled, ready to attack. There was no other way. Freya put Max down gently but hastily, then immediately turned to face the wolf. Despite her exhausted body, she still bared her teeth, growling fiercely, her eyes shining with absolute determination. If necessary, she was ready to fight, even if this could be the last time. The wolf retreated a little, seemingly surprised by Freya's tenacity. But it was not alone. Other shadows had begun to surround it. Freya glanced at Max. Her son was still lying motionless in the snow. At this moment, nothing was more important than Max's life. Suddenly, a cracking sound rang out from afar. Freya and the wolf pack simultaneously looked in the direction of the sound. In the distance, a spot of light flickered in the snowstorm. The light of a human. Freya did not miss the opportunity. She immediately bit Max's nape, lifted him up, and ran at full speed towards the light. She didn't dare turn around. The howling behind her faded, but Freya didn't stop. Her heart was pounding, her legs were tired, but she kept running. The light was getting closer. And then, in the thick snow, a figure appeared. A small wooden house appeared in the middle of the snowstorm. Freya had arrived. She struggled to take a few more steps. Every muscle in her body felt like it was about to explode, but she reached the door. With the last of her strength, she gently placed Max on the porch, then raised her head. The door in front of her was still tightly closed. There was no movement. Freya tried to scratch lightly at the door with her cold claws, making soft scratching sounds. But her strength was gone. She didn't have enough strength to bark, to call for help. The light inside was dim, but no one appeared. Suddenly, the door shook slightly. Freya tried to raise her head one last time, her eyes blurred, her breathing weak. But just then, the door opened slightly. A tall figure appeared, eyes full of surprise as he looked down. Check. Freya saw that gaze. A human gaze, not cold, not dismissive. She couldn't hold on any longer. Her body collapsed onto the snow. Before she sank into darkness, the last thing she felt was a pair of warm arms holding Max and a deep voice echoing through the snowstorm. Oh my God, What happened to you guys? The space was plunged into darkness, with only the light from the snowflakes reflecting weakly under the gray sky. The wind was still howling, howling like an invisible monster, dragging the bone-chilling cold into every strand of hair. There was nothing but snow and the cruel cold. Freya opened her eyes. Her mind was spinning, her legs stiff as if frozen. Everything around her seemed to be spinning, blurred in the white snow. She couldn't remember how long she had been unconscious. Maybe just a few minutes. Maybe longer. But the only thing she could clearly feel was that Max's small, limp body was still lying right next to her. Max didn't move. Freya's heart ached. She quickly pressed her nose against her son's small body. A weak breath came out from his dry mouth. Still alive. But that breath was so fragile, so weak, as if just a stronger wind blew by, this small life would disappear into nothingness. There was no stopping. She stood shakily, shaking her head to clear the dizziness. Her body ached, every bone groaning in protest, but she didn't care. She picked Max up, holding him tight in her jaw, and continued on. The wind whipped at her face, stinging like 1,000 needles piercing her flesh. Her tired legs sank deep into the snow, each step a struggle. Bare branches stuck out like demonic hands, reaching into the darkness, ready to pounce on any weakling lost in the storm. The howling still echoed somewhere behind her. Farther away, but not gone. The wolves were still watching. Freya knew they hadn't given up. They were patient predators. They didn't attack immediately, they waited. Waited for their prey to be exhausted. Waited until she collapsed, when she could no longer run or fight. She couldn't let that happen. But her body no longer obeyed. Freya tried to run, but each step felt like stone. Her eyelids drooped, her breath coming in short, hot gasps in her chest. Her head felt dizzy. The world around her blurred, blurring between reality and illusion. I can't stop. I can't stop. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet disappeared. Freya screamed silently as her body plummeted down the slope. The snow below her broke apart, sliding away in an icy waterfall. She rolled, rolling with the avalanche, spinning in the darkness, in the cold wind. Max. In her confusion, Freya clenched her jaw to keep Max safe. Snow whipped at her face, into her eyes, completely obscuring her vision. The world became a white whirlpool, weightless, directionless. Then everything stopped. A loud crash. She bounced off the snow, rolling a few more times before her body stopped. Her head hit a hard tree trunk, stinging. A silence fell. Only the howling wind. Freya groaned softly, a numb feeling running through her body. Pain, cold, tired. But the only thing she cared about was, where was Max? She panicked and got up, scanning the area. And then she saw a small figure lying motionless in the white snow. Max. Freya rushed over. She nudged Max with her nose. No response. She licked his little face, calling out softly, trying to wake him up. No response. She gasped, panicked. No, it couldn't be. She couldn't lose Max. Freya did the only thing she could do. She wrapped her legs around Max, using her body to cover him, transmitting the little warmth she had left. She licked at his cold, wet fur, trying to warm him up. He had to wake up, son. He had to wake up. Max stirred. A small whimper. Freya almost cried. But she didn't have time. She had to keep going. She carefully picked Max up again. Pain, exhaustion. But she stood. She had to keep going. She had to get to the light. I can't stop. She ran into the darkness again, through the storm, to the only place where her son could be saved. To the only place where there was hope. The old wooden door shook slightly in the strong wind. A thick layer of snow covered the porch, clinging to every crack in the small cabin that stood alone at the edge of the forest. In that lonely house, a man sat pensively by the fireplace, his eyes silently watching the flames dancing in the darkness. Jack was used to this silence. A life without noise, without people, without troubles. Just him, the cold winds, and the endless darkness of winter. That was the life he had chosen after leaving everything behind. He flipped through the old book, his eyes skimming the lines, but his mind drifting to distant memories. He had not been like this before. There had been another Jack, a passionate, life-loving man who believed in saving small lives. But it all ended on that fateful day, the day he lost his most loyal friend. The howling wind outside startled him out of his thoughts. A sense of unease rose within him. How long had it been since he had a visitor? No one passed through this land in winter. But something was different. A faint sound echoed through the howling winds. Jack squinted. A light, scratching sound. He sprang to his feet. The scratching sound again. Very faint, almost swallowed by the wind. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the snow. There was someone out there. Jack hurried to the door, a little uneasy. He wasn't used to people coming to see him. But if someone were lost in the woods in this weather, they wouldn't survive long. He pulled the door open. The cold wind rushed in immediately, making him shiver. But it wasn't the cold that made him freeze. It was the sight before him. A mother dog, a German shepherd, lay collapsed on the porch, snow covering her frail body. Her deep brown eyes were half open, trying to look at him, but she had no strength left. And right next to her, a tiny puppy, almost motionless. Jack rushed out immediately, kneeling beside the two pitiful creatures. He placed his hand on the puppy's body hold. So weak, almost lifeless. A shiver ran down his spine. If he didn't do something right away, they would both die. Without hesitation, he picked them both up, turned and walked quickly back into the house. The fireplace was still burning, the warmth spreading through the small room. Jack placed the mother dog near the fire, then quickly wrapped the puppy in a thick blanket. But just as he was about to check on it, a faint whine rang out. He turned around. The mother dog, she was struggling to raise her head, despite her exhausted body. Its eyes stared at him. A pleading look. A look filled with worry, but also hope. Jack was silent. It didn't care about itself. It only cared about its child. Jack sighed softly. Don't worry, I won't let it die. His words were gentle, but full of certainty. The mother dog continued to look at him for a long time, then seemed to feel more secure. She lowered her head, closed her eyes. But she didn't sleep. Even though she was so exhausted that she couldn't move, she still tried to stay awake. She wouldn't take her eyes off her child, not even for a second. Jack bent down to look at the puppy. Cold, small, weak. He placed his hand on its chest. Its heartbeat was very weak, but still there. A glimmer of hope. Without hesitation, he quickly took a warm towel carefully, drying its small body. Then he took a small bottle of warm water and gently pressed it against its belly to transfer heat. The puppy whimpered softly, its body trembling slightly. Jack chuckled. Good little one, let's continue. He continued to gently rub the soft fur, helping the blood circulate better. After a few minutes, the puppy's breathing became more even. Still weak, but no longer in critical condition. Jack looked up at the mother dog. It was still watching him. He felt something. It wasn't just trust. It was also pleading. It had placed all its hope in him. Jack sighed softly, then looked towards the window. Outside, the wind was still blowing hard. The snow was still falling nonstop. But inside this small house, a ray of light had been lit. And Jack knew he was no longer alone. The small room was lit by a flickering fire, but the cold still seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls. Jack sat by the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the small puppy wrapped in a warm blanket. Its breathing was weak, each rise and fall so light it was almost imperceptible. In his life as a veterinarian, he had seen many emergencies, many lives hanging between life and death. But this time, there was something different. Unlike the previous times, he was not simply doing his job as a doctor. He felt something connecting him to this little creature. He turned to look at the mother dog. She was still lying there, exhausted, but her eyes did not leave her puppy. A worried, fearful, but also hopeful look. Jack took a deep breath. He knew he could not let her down. He stood up, walking quickly toward the small kitchen in the corner of the room. He rummaged through the old wooden cabinet, pulling out a bottle of warm milk and a small syringe. Without his mother, Max couldn't drink properly. He had to help him. He sat down next to Max, gently lifting his head. Slowly he put the tip of the syringe into his mouth, dripping warm milk onto his tongue. Max flinched slightly. Jack held his breath. Would he swallow? 1 second. 2 seconds. A very slight movement in his throat. Jack chuckled. Good job, little one. He continued to feed Max little by little, slowly and patiently. By the last drop, His breathing had become a little more steady. Still weak, but at least he had a chance. Jack let out a sigh of relief. But just as he was about to stand up, a soft whine sounded. He turned. The mother dog. Freya was still lying there, but her breathing was becoming more rapid. Jack quickly realized that her body was shaking violently. Not from the cold, but from exhaustion. Jack frowned. He had been so focused on Max that he had forgotten that Freya was in equally dangerous condition. He quickly grabbed another warm towel and knelt down beside her. "Little girl, don't give up." Jack gently placed his hand on Freya's back, feeling the faint warmth from her body. He didn't know what she had been through before coming here, but she had certainly sacrificed everything for her child. He took some warm water and gently pressed it to Freya's muzzle. Come on. Drink some." Freya opened her eyes slightly. She looked at Jack as if trying to understand what he was doing. Jack gently patted her. "Trust me. She can't fall now." Freya whimpered softly, then slowly, very slowly, she stuck out her tongue, licking some water. Jack smiled faintly. Little by little, he helped her drink water, then took some more soft food, bringing it close to her mouth. At first, Freya didn't react. But then her survival instinct kicked in. She weakly stretched her head forward, licking the first bit of food after many days of starvation. Jack sighed in relief. "Good. Let's continue." He sat beside her, patiently helping her eat little by little. Outside, the storm was still raging. But inside the small house, a silent battle for survival was taking place. A man, a mother dog, a puppy. None of them gave up. Jack sat there all night, unable to sleep. He kept staring at Max and Freya, watching their every breath. Any sign of trouble, and he would act. Time passed slowly. Every moment was a struggle. Then, as dawn broke, pale sunlight filtering through the windows, Jack realized something. Max was breathing more evenly. Freya was no longer shaking. For the first time in hours of tension, Jack leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep, but he knew they had made it through the first night. And this was just the beginning. The pale morning sunlight filtered through the frosted glass windows, illuminating the small room where life was slowly coming back to life. Jack sat on the old wooden chair, his eyes thoughtfully following Max's every small breath. He had been awake all night, not taking his eyes off the puppy and its mother. Max was doing better, though his breathing was still weak. His body was no longer as cold as last night, his soft fur completely dry, thanks to the warmth from the fireplace and Jack's attentive care. But what caught his attention most was Freya. The mother dog was still there, her deep brown eyes half open, as if she never dared to sleep for fear that when she woke up, her child would be gone. Jack knew that feeling. The anxiety, the fear of seeing the person she loved most leave. He had been through it, and it had made him who he was today, a recluse away from the world. He cleared his throat, pulling himself out of his thoughts. "All right, little girl. It's a new day." Freya glanced at him, but didn't react. She still didn't move much, her body exhausted from the long days of fighting. The harsh nature. Jack stood up, walked into the kitchen, took a bowl of warm water and some soft food that he had prepared in advance. He knelt down beside Freya, gently pushing the bowl of water towards her. "Here, drink some. You've done well." Freya slowly looked at him, her eyes skeptical. But it seemed that after a night of care, she had somewhat accepted this human's presence. She stuck out her tongue, licking a mouthful of water. Jack smiled. "Good. Continue." Freya continued to drink, small but steady sips. Although she was still weak, Jack knew that she was gradually recovering. He turned his attention to Max. The puppy was still weak, but at least his breathing had stabilized. He gently touched its belly, feeling the tiny heartbeat, still weak but strong. Jack took another small syringe, poured in some of the bone broth he had prepared early in the morning. He gently lifted Max's head and dripped it into its mouth. "We're not giving up, little one." Max shivered slightly, but then opened his mouth, swallowing the first drop. Jack held his breath. 1 second. 2 seconds. Max let out a soft breath, then opened his cloudy eyes. Jack chuckled softly. "That's right, let's continue." He continued to feed it little by little, slowly and patiently. This time, Max didn't refuse. It swallowed, its eyes blinking as if it were feeling warmth and safety for the first time. Freya, weak as she was, watched her child's every move. When she saw Max react, she let out a small whimper, not in pain, but in relief. Jack sat down beside her, letting out a soft sigh. He had thought he no longer had the strength to save another life. After everything that had happened, he had chosen to distance himself from everything, to distance himself from painful memories. But now, seeing Max stir slightly, seeing Freya slowly recover, he realized something. Maybe he hadn't completely lost the ability to save people. Jack looked out the window. The snowstorm had eased, but it was still very cold. He knew that Freya and Max wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. He turned to Freya, gently stroking her head. "Don't worry, little girl. We're not going anywhere. You're safe." Freya closed her eyes, as if she could finally relax after a long journey. But Jack knew the fight wasn't over. He looked at Max, then at Freya. They were out of danger, but not out of danger. Without proper care, even a small fever could take Max's life. And Freya, she seemed to be suffering more than he could see. Jack frowned. He had to do something. He stood up, walked over to the old wooden cabinet where he kept the few medical supplies he had left over from his past. Pulling open a drawer, he found some anti-inflammatory pills, some supplements, and a new syringe. He turned back to Freya. "Hey, I know you won't like this, but trust me, it'll make you feel better." Freya opened her eyes, looking at him. Jack took a small piece of meat, crushed the medicine inside, and brought it to its mouth. "Consider this your breakfast." Freya sniffed it a bit, but then, as if understanding that this was what it needed, it took a small bite of the meat, chewing slowly. Jack nodded in satisfaction. A little medicine, a little water, a little food. Everything was just a small step. But step by step, Freya and Max were slowly coming back from the brink of death. Jack looked at them, then looked back at his hands. For the first time in many years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone anymore. The snow was still covering the forest, but the blizzard had eased somewhat. The wind was no longer howling, replaced by an eerie silence. However, the cold was still biting, seeping into every crevice of the small wooden house. Jack stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the gray sky outside. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. Freya had been noticeably weaker over the past 2 days. Despite his best efforts to care for her, her condition had not improved. The fact that she refused to eat much and only drank a little water was a worrying sign. Max, despite showing signs of recovery, was still very weak. Her stomach couldn't take much food, and her breathing was still weak. Without timely medical intervention, Jack wasn't sure she could survive. He gritted his teeth and turned around. "We have to get to town." Freya, though lying motionless, seemed to understand his words. She opened her eyes and looked at Jack, her eyes filled with doubt and worry. Jack sat down next to her, gently stroking Freya's shaggy fur. "I know you don't trust humans, but you have to trust me. We have no choice." Freya kept her eyes on him, but she didn't object. She knew Jack was right. Jack quickly prepared. He grabbed a thick blanket, wrapped Max in it to keep him warm, and carefully placed him in a chest pack. Then he put on a thick fur coat, snow boots, and gloves. But the biggest challenge was how to take Freya with him. She couldn't walk far in her condition, and Jack couldn't carry her all the way. He looked out, then turned to the corner of the house where his old sled still lay, covered in a thin layer of dust. This might be the only way. He pulled the sled outside, brushed off the dust and snow on the surface, and lined it with a thick blanket. Then he turned around and gently lifted Freya onto the sled. "Hold on. I won't let you fall." Freya whimpered, but she didn't struggle. She was too weak to fight back, and more importantly, she understood that Jack was trying to help her. Jack tightened the rope around his waist, took a deep breath, and walked. Each step he took sank deeper into the snow, each lift taking twice as much effort as usual. The sled wasn't heavy, but pulling it through the thick snow wasn't easy. The forest was strangely silent. Only the crunch of snow underfoot and Jack's panting echoed in the white space. The snow was falling lighter, but it was still cold. Jack could feel the cold seeping through his clothes, seeping into his flesh. But he couldn't stop. He knew he was in a race against time. He quickened his pace, his resolve growing stronger. But then, after only a short distance, Jack realized another problem. The road ahead was completely buried under a thick layer of snow. Jack bit his lip. This was the quickest route to town, but if he continued down this path, he might get stuck. He took a deep breath, thinking quickly. There was another path around the eastern hills, but it was longer and more dangerous because the terrain was steep and slippery. He didn't have many options. Turning the sled around, Jack turned onto the path around. The ground was steeper, but there was less snow because the wind had blown some of the covering away. That made it a little easier to move, but it also made the path much more dangerous. Underfoot were slippery rocks hidden under a thin layer of ice. If he wasn't careful, one wrong step could send him tumbling, dragging Freya and Max down the slope. He tightened the rope, walking slowly but surely. But then a sudden gust of wind hit. Jack stumbled. The sled's wheels came off the road, sliding down the slope. He tugged on a rope, trying to keep his balance. But the pull was too great. The sled tipped over. Freya groaned. Jack cursed, lunging forward, trying to keep the sled from rolling down the slope. The ground beneath his feet was as slippery as glass. And then he slipped. His whole body fell, dragging the sled with him. They rushed down the slope in a panic. Jack tried to grab onto anything he could, but the snow was too thick, there was nothing to hold on to. Freya groaned weakly. Max was still wrapped in the blanket, motionless. Jack's heart was pounding. He had to do something. Just before they hit a large boulder, Jack reached out and grabbed a small branch jutting out of the snow. He yanked. His whole body was jerked back, the sled coming to a stop just short of the edge. Jack gasped, his whole body aching from the impact. But he didn't care. He turned to look at Freya. She was still there, but her eyes were filled with fear. He looked down at Max. She was still breathing. Jack closed his eyes and took a deep breath. They were still alive, but they couldn't afford to make another mistake. He adjusted the sled, checked the tow rope, and continued on. He didn't stop. The battle wasn't over yet, and he wouldn't let any of them loose. Jack gritted his teeth and pulled the sled rope hard across the icy road. His breath turned into white smoke in the cold air. His hands were numb from the cold, but he didn't dare stop. Every second was a fight for Freya and Max's lives. Ahead, the dim lights of the town gradually appeared between the bare trees. It was the only place where they could be saved. Jack wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and picked up his pace. His steps became more and more steady, even though his legs ached as if being hammered with every step. The door of the veterinary clinic was right at the corner of town. On the old wooden sign, the words, faded with age, were still written, Walker Veterinary Clinic. Jack almost collapsed as he reached the threshold, his shaking hands pounding on the wooden door. Dr. Walker. Open the door. I need help. The house was silent for a moment. Then there was a hurried noise inside. The door swung open, revealing a middle-aged man with graying hair, a haggard face but sharp eyes. Jack. Jack nodded, not having time to explain. He walked straight in, pulling the sled. Doctor, I need your help now. Dr. Walker looked down at the two creatures huddled on the sled. His eyes flashed with surprise, but he asked no further questions. Put them on the examination table now. Jack quickly lifted Max out first. The puppy was still breathing weakly, her small body barely responding. Freya was still lying there, almost motionless. Walker bent down to examine Max first. He gently lifted her eyelids, listened to her heartbeat, and sighed. She's very weak, but luckily you kept her warm in time. We can save her. Jack felt a wave of relief spread through his chest. But before he could say anything, Dr. Walker turned to Freya, his face much more serious. But the mother is different. Jack stared at him. How is she? Walker was silent for a moment, placing his hand on Freya's body, listening to her weak heartbeat. She's been through a lot of stress. Her immune system is severely weakened, and I suspect she has a mild case of pneumonia. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Can you save her? Walker nodded, but his eyes were serious. Maybe if she cooperates. But that depends on her will. To live. Jack turned to look at Freya. Her eyes opened a little, still as determined as they had been the past few days. She had gone through the storm, the deadly cold, the hunger, just to get Max here. She couldn't collapse now. Then do it, Jack said firmly. Walker did not hesitate. He took a syringe, drew out the antibiotic, and injected it into Freya. Then he placed her on a small bed next to the fireplace to keep her warm. Jack sat down on the chair, looking at the two small lives before him. He felt his chest heave. Dr. Walker stood up, turned to Jack, and crossed his arms over his chest. You haven't changed a bit. Jack raised his head, frowning. What do you mean? Walker smiled faintly. Still the same Jack as before. Still rushing to save weak creatures without thinking about himself. Jack clenched his fists, his eyes darkening. Don't talk like you understand me. Walker sighed, pulling up a chair and sitting down across from Jack. I understand you better than you think. And I also understand why you've been hiding in the woods all these years. Jack didn't answer. He turned away, but Walker didn't let go. Buddy, I know you haven't gotten over it yet. Jack stiffened at the sound of that name. Buddy, his most loyal friend. The dog that had been with him through so many years had saved him, had been by his side when he fell. And then he had lost it. Jack clenched his jaw, his hands unconsciously clenching into fists. I don't want to talk about it. Walker looked at him for a long moment, then sighed softly. You think running away will help you forget? Jack, you're not a coward. You've never been a quitter. Jack smiled faintly, but there was bitterness in his eyes. Then why did I let Buddy die? Walker didn't answer right away. He knew Jack didn't really expect an answer. In the warm room, amid the flickering fire, a heavy silence fell. Only the faint breathing of Freya and Max, a reminder of reality. Walker stood up, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. You can spend the rest of your life regretting it, or you can stand up and do something to make it up. Saving them, it could be the second chance you never got with Buddy. Jack said nothing. He just stared at Freya and Max. And in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt something familiar in his chest. Something he thought had died long ago. Hope. Outside, the blizzard had subsided, and only a light breeze blew through the icy streets of the small town. Snow still lay thickly on the roofs and steps, but was no longer as fierce as before. The pale morning light filtered through the clouds, casting a soft yellow hue across the white world. Inside the clinic, the fire in the fireplace was still burning brightly, spreading warmth throughout the room. Jack sat on the old wooden chair, his eyes fixed on the two small creatures curled up on the thick blanket. Max, though still weak, was beginning to stir. The little puppy was no longer lying motionless as he had found it in the storm. Its tiny chest rose and fell rhythmically, its breathing no longer rapid. The signs of life were becoming more evident. Freya was still lying there, but her eyes were more alert. She was no longer breathing as laboredly as last night. When Jack's eyes met hers, he could see a glimmer of light, not just exhaustion, but gratitude. You did well, little girl, Jack said softly, his voice strangely gentle. Freya didn't reply, of course, but her eyes followed Max's every move like a mother's, concerned for her child. Dr. Walker entered the room, carrying a bowl of warm water and some soft food. He set them down beside Freya and looked at Jack. You did well, he said. You're the only one alive. Jack didn't answer right away. He looked at Freya, then down at his hands, the hands that had held those fragile lives through the long journey through the snowstorm. A thought crossed his mind. Was this why fate had brought him to this point? He had lost Buddy. He had been lost in the pain of the past, isolated from the world, running away from what had hurt him. But now here he was, fighting to save another life, to make up for the mistake he had carried with him for so many years. Walker seemed to read Jack's thoughts. He sat down across from him, arms crossed over his chest. What are you thinking? Jack took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on Freya and Max. I don't know, he muttered. I never thought I'd do this. Walker chuckled. Then why are you doing it? Jack didn't answer right away. He just sat there, watching Max gently move, snuggling into the warm blanket. It let out a small whimper, as if trying to find safety. Freya, still very weak, sat up slightly, licking her child's head. The moment made Jack's heart stop. He stood up, walked over to Freya, and knelt down. Little girl, would you like to come with me? Freya looked up at him, her deep brown eyes filled with doubt. Jack held out his hand, not too close, but not too far. An offer. A choice. Freya looked at him for a long moment. Then, in a slow but decisive motion, she placed her head on his hand. Jack paused. He hadn't expected this reaction. A deep breath escaped his chest. He felt something melt inside him, a block of ice that had been there all these years, now slowly cracking. Walker smiled. It seems you're not alone anymore, Jack. Jack didn't reply, but something in his eyes had changed. No more bitterness. No more darkness. But a small ray of light, a ray of hope. He knew from this moment on he had a new family. The storm had passed, leaving a world of white snow. The weak sunlight filtered through the gray clouds, illuminating the road leading out of town. Jack walked slowly, his sled no longer a rescue vehicle, but a carrier of the two small lives that had become a part of his life. Freya was still weak, but she was able to stand, though each step was slow. Max had recovered considerably, now able to move more flexibly, though still clinging to his mother like a small shadow. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the cold, fresh air fill his lungs. For the first time in many years, he did not feel lonely as he returned to his wooden house. The small town gradually disappeared behind the trees. This trip was not only to save two lives, but also to save himself. But as they neared the house, a strange figure suddenly appeared at the door. Jack paused. A man stood there, clad in a thick gray coat, his hands in his pockets, his dark hair tousled by the cold wind. He was looking at Jack, his eyes filled with something unnameable, regret, anticipation, or perhaps simply an unspoken sadness. Jack squinted. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Tom, his best friend, or at least what had been his best friend. How many years had it been since they'd seen each other? 5 years? 10 years? Jack had thought he'd never see Tom again, that their pasts were buried with painful memories. Tom raised his hand, as if to wave, then lowered it, unsure whether to continue. Jack tightened his grip on the sled's drawstring, his gaze cold. What are you doing here? His voice was dry, emotionless. Tom smiled awkwardly. Jack, he hesitated, then sighed softly. I don't know. Jack stared at Tom, saying nothing. A light breeze blew by, stirring the snow into the air. Freya growled softly. She could feel the tension between them. Max curled up in the blanket, snuggling closer to his mother. Tom glanced at the two dogs, then back at Jack. A smile flickered across his lips. Did you save someone again? Jack didn't answer. Tom nodded, as if he knew the story without needing to be told. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Tom sighed, his shoulders slumping. I know you're still mad at me. His voice trailed off, a hint of sadness in it. I don't blame you for that. Jack remained silent. Tom smiled slightly, but it wasn't a happy smile. I've thought about coming back here many times, but I always stop halfway. He glanced at Jack. I guess I was scared. Jack blinked, his eyes wavering for the first time. Tom, was he scared? The man who had been his best friend, the one who had been with him through the best of times and the darkest of nightmares, was afraid to face him? Jack gritted his teeth, an old emotion suddenly rising within him. So, why did you come now? He asked, his voice a little harsher than he had intended. Tom looked at him, his eyes so sincere that Jack couldn't ignore them. Because I realized, if I kept running away, I would never forgive myself. The words were like an invisible knife stabbing into Jack's chest. He knew that feeling. The feeling of someone who had lost so much, and then realized that he couldn't hide from the truth forever. Freya, as if sensing the change in the air, stopped growling. She just stood there, her bright brown eyes sparkling, as if observing the conversation between the two people. Tom looked at Freya, then back at Max. Something flashed in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps. He smiled slightly, a nostalgic smile. Jack, I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know that I'm still me, and I don't want to lose the only thing I have left in my life. Jack didn't reply, but something in his heart had changed. It wasn't anger, nor resentment, just a strange feeling. It was as if, after so many years, a door in the past had opened, letting light in once more. The morning sky was clear of the dark clouds of the snowstorm. The thin sunlight filtered through the bare branches, covering the white snow with a pale yellow light. Everything was peaceful and quiet, as if the whole world had just gone through a fierce battle and was now enjoying the first moments of rebirth. Jack stood on the porch, his eyes turned to the distant horizon. Taking a deep breath, he felt the smell of melting snow, the cold wind, and the warmth of the fire in the fireplace behind him. Inside, Freya lay on a thick carpet, her eyes half closed but filled with serenity. She was no longer the exhausted mother dog lost in the storm. Now she was healed, stronger, but most of all, she had found a place to call home. Max, the little puppy who had been lying motionless on the doorstep, was now able to run around the room. Each step was still a little unsteady, but with each passing day, it grew steadier. And Jack, for the first time in years, he felt less lost. Behind him, Tom leaned against the wooden wall, his hands in his coat pockets. The two of them hadn't spoken much since their meeting the day before. But something in the air between them had changed. There was no distance, no heavy tension. There was only silence, but not the silence of pain. It was the silence of people who had been friends, who had drifted apart, and were now finding a way to connect again. Tom spoke first, his voice low and sincere. "Can I stay for a while?" Jack turned to look at him, a moment of hesitation in his eyes. But then he nodded. "As long as you don't interfere with my life." Tom smiled softly. "No promises." Jack chuckled, a sound he didn't think he could make after all these years. Freya sat up slightly, watching the two men with a wary but not wary look. Max trotted over to Jack, jumping up to his feet. Jack bent down and patted him on the head. "Okay, kid. We have a new life to start." The sunlight shone on Jack's face, making his eyes shine in a strange way. For the first time in years, he wasn't a lost soul in the big wide world. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged here. And for the first time, he truly believed that there were things in life worth starting over. This story is not just about a brave mother dog and her journey of survival. It is also a story of redemption, healing, and how love, whether between humans or animals, can help a person find themselves again. Freya fought to save her child, not giving up even when death was near. It was a mother's instinct, a testament to unconditional sacrifice. Max was weak, almost at the brink of death, but thanks to his mother's love and Jack's help, he was given a chance to live on. It shows that with hope, with timely help, even the most fragile lives can be stronger than ever. Jack is a man who has lost himself after losses in the past. But it was Freya and Max who brought him back, helping him understand that the past cannot be changed, but the present and the future can. Helping another life is not only a way to save them, but also a way to save himself. And Tom, a friend who had been separated from him, came back. Not to erase the old mistakes, but to prove that even relationships that seem broken can be repaired, as long as people still want to fix it. This story reminds us that no matter what happens, no matter how harsh life is, as long as we don't give up, there is always a chance to start over. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to not miss other meaningful stories. We believe that each story told will bring human values, profound lessons that everyone can find a part of themselves in. What do you think about the journey of Jack, Freya, and Max? Have you ever experienced a moment where you had to stand up after loss like Jack? Leave a comment below to let us know what you think. And don't forget to click the bell icon to receive notifications when there are new videos. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next story.